The snow came not as a blanket, but as a shroud. It fell from a sky the color of old pewter, thick and silent, burying the Wyoming territory in a white so complete it erased the horizon. For 3 days, Colt McRae had watched it fall, a world being unmade and remade in elemental quiet. From the single window of his cabin, the pines at the edge of the clearing looked like ghosts hunched in white cloaks. The wind, his only companion, moaned a low tune through the chinking in the logs, a sound he had long ago stopped noticing. His life was a map of small, deliberate movements. Rise before the sun fully committed to the sky. Stoke the fire. Boil coffee that was more chicory than bean. Check the cattle. 24 head of hardy stock huddled in their lean-to, their breath pluming like smoke signals in the frigid air. Chop wood. Mend what was broken. Eat. Sleep. The rhythm was a fortress he had built around himself, log by log, day by day, for 5 years. It kept the past where it belonged, buried deeper than any winter snow. This morning, the storm had paused, holding its breath. The silence it left behind was immense, a ringing in the ears. Colt pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, the wool worn smooth in places from years of labor. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he opened the door, stealing the air from his lungs. He squinted at the landscape, a vast and punishing beauty that asked for nothing and gave nothing, save for the space to be alone. His boots sank deep, the crunch of the fresh powder the only sound in the universe. He made his way toward the woodshed, his mind on the dwindling supply of split logs. You could never have enough wood. It was the difference between a hard winter and your last winter. That was when he saw it, a smudge of color against the white, halfway between the cabin and the woodpile. It was a mound, dark and unnatural, already being claimed by the drifting snow. His first thought was a wolf, maybe a young one, caught out in the storm. They had been bolder this year, their howls a nightly chorus from the high ridges. He moved with a practiced caution, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, a tool as familiar to him as his axe. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a person, face down, a tangle of dark hair spilling from beneath a thin hood. A woman. A wave of disbelief washed over him. So sharp, it felt like the cold itself. People did not just appear out here. This was his space, his hard-won solitude. He knelt, his knee sinking into the powder. He reached out a gloved hand and gently turned her shoulder. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with a bluish tint to her lips. One cheek was marred by a dark, ugly bruise that blossomed across the bone. Her dress, a simple calico thing, was torn at the shoulder and hem, offering no real protection against the brutal cold. It was a miracle she was not frozen solid. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for the faint flutter of life. He held his breath, waiting. Nothing. He shifted his fingers, pressing a little harder into the hollow beneath her jaw. And then he felt it, a thread, a slow, thready pulse, as faint as a bird's wing beat, but it was there. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Alive, against all odds. She was alive. He looked around, his gaze scanning the unbroken expanse of snow. What was her story? How did she end up here, at the edge of his world? Dressed for a summer afternoon instead of a Wyoming blizzard, his eyes caught a faint disturbance near the edge of the clearing. He stood and walked toward it, his long strides eating up the distance. The wind had worked hard to erase the evidence, but it was there if you knew how to look. The shallow, parallel grooves of a buckboard's wheels, and beside them, the deeper impressions of a horse's hooves. They led from the direction of the old trapper's trail, a path rarely used since the railroad went through farther south. From the faint tracks of the buckboard, a single set of smaller footprints stumbled away, weaving a desperate, erratic path toward the faint promise of his cabin's smoke before they stopped. She had run. She had run until she could not run another step. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature settled in his gut. This was trouble. Trouble had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran. He had learned that lesson the hard way in Laramie. A flash of memory, unwanted and sharp, the smell of gunpowder, a woman's scream, the sight of a man falling. He shook his head, pushing it away. That was another life. But this was this life, and in this life, there was a woman freezing to death 100 feet from his fire. He went back to her and scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bundle of cold limbs and damp cloth. She made a small sound, a bare sigh, and her head lolled against his chest. He carried her back to the cabin, his boots leaving a deep trench in the new snow. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, shutting out the vast, indifferent white world. He laid her down gently on the bearskin rug in front of the stone hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. He added kindling and a few split logs, coaxing it back to life with a bellows. Flames licked up, casting a warm, flickering light across her still form. In the growing light, he saw things he had missed outside. Her hands were raw, her knuckles scraped, and on her left wrist, peeking from the cuff of her dress, was a faint, pinkish line, a chafe mark. He gently pushed the sleeve back a fraction of an inch. The mark circled her entire wrist, the skin rubbed raw in a perfect, damning line. A rope burn. He stood up and ran a hand through his hair. She had not just been running from the storm. She had been running from someone who had tied her up. The story was getting darker with every detail. He felt a familiar anger, a cold, hard knot tightening in his stomach. It was the same anger that had led to the trouble in Laramie. He had thought he had buried it, left it behind with the man he used to be. But here it was, unearthed by a stranger's plight. He knew what he had to do. Keeping her alive was the first thing, the only thing that mattered right now. He filled a kettle with water from the bucket by the door and hung it over the fire. He found an old, clean wool blanket in his trunk and carefully, respectfully, began to remove her wet, frozen clothes. Her dress was stiff with ice. As he worked, he kept his eyes averted, focusing on the task, granting her what little dignity he could. He wrapped her in the heavy blanket, tucking it snugly around her small frame. Her breathing was shallow, but it was steady. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling a mournful song around the eaves of the cabin. A wolf howled, a lonely, hungry sound that was answered by another, closer this time. They were on the move, smelling the cattle, or perhaps something more. Colt went to the door and barred it. He took his Winchester from the pegs on the wall and checked the action. It was a comfort, the solid weight of the rifle in his hands. He looked back at the woman by the fire, a ghost delivered by the storm. He did not know her name. He did not know where she came from or what horrors she was fleeing. All he knew was that her footprints had ended at his door. For a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, he was now responsible for another human life. A deep, weary sigh escaped him. He had built this cabin to keep the world out. Now, it seemed, he had just brought it all inside. He pulled a stool closer to the fire, laid the rifle across his lap, and prepared to wait. The fire crackled, a small beacon of life against the encroaching dark. The woman slept on, her face in the firelight still and peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence that had brought her here. The winter, he knew, was far from over. Time in the cabin became measured not by the hands of a clock, which Colt did not own, but by the life cycle of the fire. He fed it, tended it, and in return, it gave them warmth, light, and a fragile pocket of existence carved out of the howling wilderness. For the rest of that first day, and through the long, dark night, the woman did not wake. She remained cocooned in the thick wool blanket, a still form whose only sign of life was the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Colt sat his vigil, the Winchester resting across his knees, listening to the two competing sounds, the storm's fury outside and the woman's quiet breathing within. He moved with a deliberate economy, his actions stripped to their essential purpose. He melted snow for water, from a smoked ham hock hanging from the rafters. He carved a piece and set it to simmer with a handful of dried beans, creating a thin, salty broth. The scent filled the small space, a humble aroma of sustenance. He was careful not to crowd her, keeping his movements to the far side of the cabin, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fear she would surely feel upon waking in a strange place with a strange man. He was a large man, and he knew his size could be intimidating. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of work, were tools for building and breaking, and he was conscious of how they might look to someone who had known violence. She woke as the new day's light struggled to pierce the gray pall of the storm. It was not a gentle stirring, but a sudden, violent shudder that racked her body. Her eyes flew open, wide with a terror that was absolute and primal. They darted around the unfamiliar room, the rough-hewn log walls, the smoky rafters, the animal hides tacked up for insulation before they landed on him. He was sitting on his stool, his hat casting a shadow over his face, a tin cup of coffee held in his hands. He saw the recognition of a threat in her eyes, the tensing of her muscles as she prepared to fight or flee, even though she had the strength for neither. Colt did not move. He remained perfectly still, meeting her terrified gaze without expression. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of a spooked horse. Any sudden movement, any sharp word, would send it bolting. He held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, giving her time to see that he was not moving toward her, that his hands were occupied with the cup. Slowly, deliberately, he set his coffee on the floor beside him. He ladled some of the warm broth into another tin cup, his motions measured and unhurried. He stood up, and she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around her as if it were a shield. He stopped, holding the cup out. He took one slow step forward, then another, until he was close enough to set the cup on the floor, just within her reach, but far enough away that he did not have to lean over her. Then he retreated, returning to his stool and picking up his own cup. He said nothing. The invitation was in the offering itself. He did not ask her name, did not ask how she came to be in the snow. The story was written in the bruise on her cheek and the raw chafing on her wrist. Questions would only be a form of trespass. For now, survival was the only language they needed. She watched him for a long time, her breathing shallow. Her gaze flickered between his face and the steaming cup. Finally, propelled by a thirst and a cold that went bone deep, she reached a trembling hand from beneath the blanket. Her fingers struggled to close around the warm tin. She drew it back into her cocoon and, with shaking hands, brought the cup to her lips. She sipped the broth, the warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first small victory against the cold that had nearly claimed her. The next 3 days were a siege. The storm did not relent. It hurled snow and wind at the small cabin, piling drifts against the door and windows, isolating them completely from the rest of the world. Time blurred into a cycle of tending the fire, melting snow, and sipping broth. A silent language formed between them, a grammar of gestures and shared space. When he needed to go outside to the lean-to to check on the cattle, he would pull on his coat, and she would watch, her eyes following him to the door. When he returned, covered in snow, she would have her gaze fixed on the fire, granting him the privacy to shake off the cold. He left her food and water. She ate. He slept on his cot on the far side of the room. She by the fire. The unspoken rule was the hearth. It was her territory. He never crossed its invisible line without a clear purpose, like adding another log to the fire. In this enforced quiet, Colt found his own thoughts to be loud companions. Every time he looked at her, huddled and silent, he felt the ghost of Laramie at his back. He had tried to intervene then, too. A dispute over a piece of the land between a small homesteader and a powerful cattle baron named Thompson. Colt had spoken up for the homesteader, Thompson, a man much like he imagined the owner of the buckboard to be, Saw law as a tool and people as property. The argument had escalated in the saloon. Voices raised, chairs pushed back. Thompson's son, arrogant and drunk, had drawn his pistol. Colt had been faster, but a stray bullet, a ricochet off a belt buckle, had struck the saloon owner's daughter, a girl of 16, in the arm. The wound was not fatal, but the chaos, the screaming, the sight of innocent blood spilled because of his actions, it had broken something in him. He had left town that night, branded a troublemaker, the weight of that unintended consequence a permanent burden. He had sought this solitude to ensure he could never cause such harm again. Now, it seemed, harm had found him anyway. To help this woman was to invite that world back in, a world of powerful men and the trouble they created. The wolves were not just the ones howling on the ridge. They were the two-legged kind, and they were far more dangerous. He could feel her shame. It radiated from her like heat from the fire. It was in the way she avoided his eyes, the way she kept the blanket pulled up to her chin, a frail barrier against not just the cold, but against judgment. She was a victim, yet she carried herself like a criminal. He recognized the feeling. It was the same shame he carried, the weight of being tangled in a violence not of your own making, yet for which you feel eternally responsible. On the second day, he tried to break the oppressive silence. He offered her a bowl of the broth, this time with a few morsels of salt pork and softened beans in it. As he set it down, he spoke, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Do not worry," he said, nodding at the bowl. "This soup has never killed anyone except for my own pride." A flicker of surprise in her eyes was his only answer, but it was a start, a small piece of dry humor offered like a peace treaty. Later that afternoon, she spoke for the first time. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely a whisper. "He said I was his." Colt was mending a piece of tack, his hands busy with the leather and all. He stopped, his head bowed, waiting for her to continue. "My father, he owed him money. A lot of money." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Mr. Voss said he would forgive the debt in exchange for me. He called it a marriage contract. My father signed it." Voss. The name landed in the quiet cabin like a stone. It was a name Colt knew. Ephraim Voss owned the sprawling Arrow V ranch that bordered the territory to the east. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, known for his ruthless ambition and for buying whatever and whoever he wanted. The law, in towns like Redemption, often bent to the will of men like Voss. "He kept me locked in a room in the ranch house," she whispered, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames, waiting for the preacher he had sent for. I got out during the storm. I took a horse and buckboard from the stable. I did not think I would get far. I just wanted to not be there when he came back." The pieces clicked into place, the rope burn, the torn dress, the desperate flight into a blizzard. It was not just a matter of a runaway wife. It was about property. To a man like Voss, that was all she was. A line item in a ledger, signed and paid for. The cold knot of anger in Colt's stomach tightened. This was Laramie all over again, but worse. He said nothing for a long time. He simply resumed his work on the leather strap, the steady rhythm of the needle passing through the thick hide, a counterpoint to the turmoil her words had unleashed. He wanted to tell her she was safe here, but he knew it would be a lie. Voss's reach was long. His cabin was a shelter, not a fortress. On the morning of the third day, the wind finally died. The silence outside was profound, and the light that filtered through the window was brighter, cleaner. The world felt new, washed clean by the storm. The woman was sitting up, the blanket draped around her shoulders. The bruise on her cheek had begun to fade, turning a sickly yellow-green. She looked at him, her eyes clear for the first time, the deep well of fear having receded, replaced by a quiet, searching gravity. "I am May," she said, her voice still quiet but stronger now. It was not a plea or a confession. It was a statement of fact, an act of reclaiming herself from the nameless thing she had become in the snow. Colt stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He gave her the simple courtesy of his full attention. He saw not just a victim, but a woman who had fought, who had survived. He offered her the only truth he had left to give. "Colt," he replied. The names settled in the small space between them. Building a bridge across the silence, they were no longer just a man and a woman, a rescuer and a survivor. They were May and Colt. For a moment, the warmth of that simple human connection held the cold reality of their situation at bay. But then, as he looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, a thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced the fragile peace. The storm had stopped. The trails would soon be passable. And in the town of Redemption, 10 miles away, there was a telegraph office. He pictured the clicking key, the electric pulse traveling down the thin iron wire, carrying a message from a man named Voss, a message describing a woman named May, a message offering a reward. The storm had trapped them, but it had also hidden them. Now, their isolation was at an end. The small cabin, which had been a sanctuary against the storm, suddenly felt very small and very exposed. A single spark of humanity had been kindled in the hearth, but the world outside was full of men who would be more than happy to extinguish it. The sharing of their names had altered the air in the cabin. It was a subtle shift, like the way light changes in the moments before dawn, but it was undeniable. The space was no longer just his shelter and her refuge. It was a place they occupied together, defined by two histories, two sets of fears. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of what had been spoken and the vast territory of what had not. Colt found himself moving with an even greater awareness of her presence. He was conscious of the sound his boots made on the floorboards, of the shadow he cast when he passed between her and the fire. He was learning a new kind of quiet, a new way of occupying space that was not about solitude, but about consideration. He saw the way she watched his hands as he worked, her gaze wary but also curious. He made sure his movements were slow and predictable, his hands always in sight, always occupied with a task whittling a peg, stirring the pot, cleaning his rifle. May, for her part, began to uncurl. The blanket was still her shield, but she no longer held it with a desperate grip. She would sit up for longer periods, her back resting against a rolled-up bearskin he had placed there for her. Her eyes, which had been dull with shock and exhaustion, were beginning to regain a spark of life. They were the color of a summer sky just after a rainstorm, a clear, searching blue. She watched the fire as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world, but he knew she was also watching him, taking his measure in small, silent increments. Trust was not a decision. He realized it was a slow-growing thing, like a seed planted in frozen ground. It needed time and warmth and the quiet assurance that the soil was safe. The test came on their 4th night together. The wind, which had been resting, returned with a vengeance. It was not the muffled moan of the blizzard, but a sharp, shrieking gale that clawed at the cabin, seeking entry. It rattled the single window pane and found every tiny crack in the log walls to whistle through, filling the small room with a symphony of ghostly sounds. Colt saw the change in her immediately. The fragile calm she had gathered around herself shattered. Her shoulders tensed. Her breathing grew shallow. The wind was not just wind to her. It was the sound of pursuit, the sound of the vast, terrifying world she had fled. She pulled the blanket tighter, her knuckles white. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. A violent, uncontrollable shivering that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He set aside the harness he was mending. He watched her for a moment, his heart a heavy, aching drum in his chest. This was a storm inside her, and it was every bit as dangerous as the one outside. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the dark window, but he knew she was not seeing the night. She was seeing a memory. A low sob escaped her, a sound of pure, helpless despair. He moved slowly, deliberately. He walked to the hearth and sat down on the floor, his back against the warm stones, placing himself between her and the door. He did not speak right away. He just sat, a solid, unmoving presence in the flickering light. "May," he said, his voice low and steady. "A quiet anchor in the gale. The door is barred. Nothing can get in." But his words were swallowed by her fear. The shudders intensified, and her crying was no longer silent. It was the wrenching, gasping sound of a spirit breaking. She was frozen, exhausted, and crying, lost in a place he could not reach with words alone. He held out his arms. It was not a demand, but an offer, a space for her to occupy if she chose. Through her tears, she saw the gesture. She hesitated, a lifetime of fear and caution warring with an immediate, desperate need for comfort. Then, with a small, shuddering movement, she leaned toward him. He was careful as he drew her in. He gathered her up, blanket and all, and lifted her into his lap. She was so slight, so fragile against his solid frame. He settled her against his chest and wrapped his arms around her, holding her firmly, securely. He could feel the violent tremors of her body through the thick wool of the blanket and his own heavy shirt. He rested his chin on the top of her head, the scent of wood smoke and pine in her hair. "It is all right," he whispered into the darkness. "I am here." He repeated the words, a low, steady mantra against the howling of the wind. He did not offer empty promises that everything would be fine. He offered only the simple, profound truth of his presence. He was here. He was not leaving. He was a wall against the storm. For a long time, she just shook, her sobs muffled against his chest. He held her, rocking her gently, as one might soothe a frightened child or a skittish foal. And slowly, miracle of miracles, the storm inside her began to subside. The violent shudders lessened into tremors, then to a faint trembling. Her crying softened from panicked gasps to the quiet, exhausted tears of release. These were different tears. They were not the tears of a person who was about to die, but of a person who had just realized she was going to live. She was not crying out of fear of him, but out of the overwhelming, heartbreaking relief of being held by someone who meant her no harm. The warmth from the fire was on her back, and the warmth of a human being was all around her. For the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. She eventually cried herself to sleep in his arms. He did not move. He sat there for hours, his back against the stones, his arms around her, listening to the wind die down and her breathing deepen into the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. The fire burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, the two of them a single silhouette against the logs. The dawn that followed was quiet and still. The world outside was covered in a fresh layer of pristine snow, the light sharp and clean. He had managed to move her back to her pallet by the fire without waking her, and when she finally opened her eyes, she looked at him with a new understanding. The fear was gone from her gaze, replaced by a deep, quiet gratitude. She saw him not as a threat, or even as a rescuer, but as a man who had offered her a kindness so profound it had anchored her soul. Later that morning, as he was checking the bar on the door, she spoke. "The door should always be barred." She said it was a statement, not a question. He nodded, his hand resting on the heavy wooden beam. "Always." He turned to face her. "And I will not," he began, searching for the right words. "I will not place a hand where it is not wanted. A nod, a look, that is all I will ever need." It was a promise, a law for their small, two-person country, a foundation on which they could build. A small smile touched her lips. "If I fall asleep," she said, her voice a little stronger, "do not let the pot burn." He felt a genuine smile tug at his own mouth. "I would rather the pot burn," he said softly, "than let you grow cold." Life settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet companionship. They spoke more, not about the past, not yet, but about small things, the way the snow clung to the pine needles, the taste of the coffee. He told her about his cattle, and she listened with an intent focus, as if the health of his herd were the most important thing in the world. He discovered she had a quiet sense of humor, a dry wit that would surface in a soft comment that would catch him by surprise and make him laugh. The world outside, however, was not content to leave them in peace. One night, as they sat in comfortable silence, a sudden, violent thud struck the door, hard enough to shake the entire cabin. It was followed by a low, guttural snarl and the sharp scrape of claws against the thick wood. May gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Colt was on his feet in an instant, the Winchester in his hands. He had seen the tracks a few days before, large as a man's handprint in the snow. A mountain lion, lean and hungry from the long winter. He moved to the door, placing his body in front of it. "Stay by the fire," he commanded, his voice low and calm, though his heart was pounding. Another heavy blow hit the door, and the wood groaned in protest. The animal was desperate. Colt did not hesitate. He raised the rifle, aimed at a point in the upper half of the door, and fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a sharp crack that echoed off the log walls. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Outside, there was a startled cry of animal fury and pain, and then the sound of a heavy body crashing away through the snow drifts. Silence descended, thick and ringing. Colt stood for a long moment, the rifle still raised, listening. There was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. He slowly lowered the Winchester. He turned and looked at May. She was pale, her eyes wide, but she was not hysterical. She was looking at him, at the rifle in his hands, at the solid, unshakable way he stood between her and the door. He had met the violence of the world with his own controlled, protective force. He had kept the beast out, and in that moment, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this small cabin, with this quiet, solitary man, was the safest place on earth. The fire in the hearth was no longer just for survival. It was the steady, beating heart of a home. The bullet hole in the door was a dark, unblinking eye. Colt had plugged it with a whittled peg, but it remained a stark reminder of the violence that lived just outside their small circle of warmth. The threat of the mountain lion had passed, but it had left a change in the air, a sharpening of the senses. Their sanctuary was defensible, but it was not invulnerable. They were an island, and the world, both animal and human, was a hungry sea. The weather broke 2 days later. The sun, a stranger for more than a week, appeared as a pale disk in the morning sky, casting a brilliant, painful glare across the endless snow. The thaw had begun. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin in a slow, steady rhythm, like the ticking of a clock that had been restarted. For Colt, the sound was not a promise of spring, but a warning. The trails would be open. The world was stirring. More pressingly, their supplies were dwindling to almost nothing. The last of the flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack. The coffee was gone. And the salt was a small, precious mound in a wooden bowl. He could hunt, but they needed staples. They needed the things that only a town could provide. He stood by the window, watching the melt, a grim set to his jaw. "I have to go to Redemption," he said, not turning to look at May. He felt her stillness behind him. She had been mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. The silence stretched, and he knew what she was thinking. His leaving would make her a target. His presence was her only shield. "It is a 10-mile ride," he continued, his voice low. "I can be there and back before sundown if the drifts are not too bad. We are out of flour and salt." "I know," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She had come to stand beside him at the window. "You should go." He turned to look at her then. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a pale, yellowish shadow. The haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a resolute strength that he was coming to admire more than he could say. She was not the same woman he had pulled from the snow. "I will bar the door from the outside," he said. "Keep the rifle close. Do not open it for any reason until you hear my signal." 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. She nodded. 3, then 2. I will remember. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin that could handle the deep snow. The air was cold, but it lacked the brutal bite of the storm. He packed a few empty sacks and mounted. Turning the horse to face the cabin, May stood in the doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. They looked at each other across the snowy expanse, a man and a woman who were not quite strangers anymore, bound by a shared ordeal. "Be careful, Colt," she called out, her voice carrying on the still air. He just nodded, a gesture that was meant to convey a reassurance he did not entirely feel. Then he turned the horse and urged it into a slow, plodding walk, breaking a new trail toward the distant promise of redemption. The town, when he finally rode onto its main street, was a study in mud and slush. The melting snow had turned the road into a brown, churning soup. Wagons were sunk to their hubs, their drivers cursing as they whipped their straining teams. Men in heavy coats and mud-caked boots stood in knots on the boardwalk, their talk a low rumble of gossip and business. After the profound silence of his cabin, the noise was a physical assault. His gaze was immediately drawn to the telegraph pole that stood in front of the land office. It was a stark, black sentinel, its single iron wire humming with a faint, almost inaudible vibration. It looked like a thread from a spider's web, a connection to a world of unseen forces. It was that wire that worried him most. He tied his horse in front of the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, his boots making a hollow sound on the planks. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of sawdust, leather, and dried apples. A handful of ranchers and trappers were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, swapping stories and drinking coffee. Colt nodded a general greeting, his eyes scanning the room. He knew most of them by sight, though he kept his distance. He went about his business, gathering what he needed: a sack of flour, a bag of beans, coffee, salt, a slab of bacon. Then he paused. He thought of May, alone in the cabin, her diet for the past week consisting of little more than thin broth. On an impulse, he picked up 2 tins of peaches, a luxury he had not allowed himself in years. He added a small bag of sugar and another sack of flour to his pile on the counter. The storekeeper, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, raised an eyebrow at the size of the order. "Stocking up for another blizzard, Colt." "Something like that," Colt said, his voice non-committal. From the group by the stove, a man spoke up, his voice loud and carrying. "Heard Ephraim Voss is offering a reward, $50. Colt kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a display of knives, but his entire body went still. Another man chuckled. $50 for what one of his prize bulls wandered off. "Not a bull," the first man said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "A woman, some gal he was set to marry, lit out during the storm. Voss is hopping mad, says she is his property. Fair and square." A third voice, younger and uncertain, chimed in. "Is that legal, calling a person property?" "It is if Judge Dake says it is," the first man shot back with authority. "The judge himself signed the writ. It is all official, based on some contract her old man signed. Says she is bound to Voss to clear a debt. He sent a telegraph to every station from here to Cheyenne. Describes her down to the color of her hair. Anyone who finds her and returns her to the ROV gets the 50. Colt felt a cold, familiar anger rise in his chest. It was the same rage that had gripped him in Laramie. The casual dehumanization, the easy way powerful men twisted the law into a club to beat the weak. He placed his items on the counter, his movements stiff. He paid for his supplies, his face a mask of indifference. He shouldered the heavy sacks and walked out, the talk of rewards and legal writs following him like a foul smell. Instead of riding straight back, he led his horse down the street to the saloon. It was also a boarding house, run by a woman named Sadie Quinn. Sadie was a widow in her late 30s, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who had managed to not only survive in this rough town but to prosper. She missed nothing, and she feared no one. If anyone knew the true lay of the land, it would be her. The saloon was quiet for this time of day. A few men sat at tables, nursing beers. At the end of the bar, Deputy Harlan, a young man who always seemed overwhelmed by his own badge, was staring into a glass of whiskey as if it held the answers to the universe. Sadie was behind the bar, polishing a glass. She looked up as Colt entered, and her observant gaze took in his laden horse outside and the tension in his shoulders. "You are a long way from your mountain, Colt McRae," she said, her voice dry. "And you are buying for two these days? Or have you developed a sudden taste for canned peaches?" Colt set a coin on the bar. "Whiskey." She poured him a glass. As she pushed it toward him, she leaned closer, her voice dropping. The wire was humming all morning. A message from Voss, a description of a young woman. A reward. He has a long reach. Colt. And Judge Dake holds the end of his leash. You are kicking a hornet's nest the size of this territory. "I am not kicking anything," he said, his voice a low growl. "I am just minding my own business." Sadie gave him a look that said she did not believe a word of it. "Your business has a habit of getting complicated. There are new faces in town. 2 men who rode in yesterday. They are not ranchers. They have the look of men who get paid to find things. They have been asking questions." Colt took a slow drink of the whiskey, letting the fire of it burn down his throat. He glanced down the bar at Deputy Harlan. The deputy met his gaze for a fleeting second, then quickly looked down at his glass, a flush rising on his neck. Harlan knew. He knew the writ was wrong, but he was a man who followed orders, a man more afraid of his superiors than his own conscience. He would be no help. Colt finished his drink and set the glass down. "Thanks for the warning." "Sadie." "It is not a warning," she replied, her voice serious. "It is a piece of advice. Be careful who you offer shelter to. Some storms do not blow over." He left the saloon and loaded the supplies onto his horse. As he mounted, he noticed them, 2 men standing across the street, pretending to inspect the wares in the blacksmith's yard. They were the men Sadie had mentioned. They were dressed in trail-worn clothes, with new-looking Winchester rifles resting in their saddle scabbards. Their hats were pulled low, but he could feel their eyes on him. They were watching him, noting the extra sack of flour, the way he scanned the street before turning his horse to leave. The ride back to the cabin was different. The beauty of the snow-covered landscape was gone, replaced by a sense of menace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every grove of trees could be an ambush. He was no longer a solitary man returning to his refuge. He was a target, and he was leading the hunters straight to their prey. When he was about a mile from the cabin, he did not follow the trail directly. He veered off, guiding his horse into a thick stand of pines. He dismounted, tethered the horse where it could not be easily seen, and removed the sacks of supplies. He would have to carry them the rest of the way. It was a precaution he had not had to take in 5 years. He made his way through the woods on foot, moving with a hunter's silence, his rifle in his hand. He circled around, approaching the clearing that held his cabin from the high ground of the ridge behind it. He crept to the edge of the trees, staying low, and peered down. The cabin looked peaceful. A thin plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a sign of the life within. For a moment, his heart ached with the desire for that peace to be real. And then he saw them. On the opposite ridge, partially concealed by a stand of aspens, were 2 riders. They were sitting perfectly still on their horses, their figures stark silhouettes against the pale sky. It was the 2 men from town. They were too far away for him to see their faces, but he did not need to. They were watching his cabin. They were watching the smoke, the sign that someone was home. They were waiting. The web had been spun, and his small, isolated world was caught right in the center of it. The fight against the cold and the wolves was over. The fight against men had just begun. He came back to the cabin like a ghost, a shadow moving through the deeper shadows of the pines. He carried the heavy sacks of supplies, not like provisions, but like burdens. The weight of the flour and salt was nothing compared to the weight of the two silent figures he had left watching from the ridge. He circled around to the back of the cabin, stacking the sacks in the snow before approaching the door. He gave the signal, 3 sharp knocks, a breath of silence, then 2 more. He heard the sound of the heavy bar being lifted from the inside, a sound that was both a welcome and a confirmation of their shared prison. The door opened a crack, and May's face appeared in the narrow opening, pale and anxious in the fading light. When she saw it was him, a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her features. She opened the door wider, and he slipped inside, bringing the cold, sharp air of the twilight in with him. He immediately slid the bar back into place. "Did you?" she started to ask, but the words died in her throat. She saw the answer in the hard set of his jaw, in the way his eyes scanned the dark corners of the room. "Everything is fine," he lied, because the truth was too heavy a burden to add to her own. "The town is a muddy mess. We are better off here." He did not tell her about the reward, or the writ signed by Judge Dake, or the 2 men with new rifles and watchful eyes. He did not need to. She could feel the change in him. The solitude he had once cultivated for peace had become a tense, tactical vigilance. He moved differently, his steps quieter, his hand never straying far from the butt of his revolver. He brought the supplies in, 1 sack at a time, making 2 trips in the growing darkness, his eyes constantly scanning the silent, snow-covered trees that ringed their clearing. That night, the weather turned again. The brief thaw was a false promise, and winter returned with a renewed fury. A bitter wind rose, driving a new squall of fine, hard snow before it. The cabin groaned under the assault, and the air grew thick with the sound of the gale. They sat by the fire, the warmth a small, defiant circle against the vast cold. The unspoken tension between them was as palpable as the storm. He was a sentinel, his gaze fixed on the door, while she watched him, her fear a quiet, steady presence. The attack came near midnight, with a suddenness that stole the breath from their lungs. It was not a tentative scratching this time. It was a full-bodied, explosive impact against the door, a heavy weight thrown with desperate, savage force. The wood shuddered, and the newly whittled peg in the bullet hole shot out, landing on the floor with a clatter. A furious snarl followed, a sound of pure, primal hunger that ripped through the noise of the wind. Colt was already moving, the Winchester leaping into his hands. May scrambled back from the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mountain lion was back, and it was no longer just curious. It was trying to break its way in. Another blow struck the door, harder this time, and the sound of splintering wood was sharp and terrifying. A long, deep scratch appeared on the inside of the door as claws, thick as a man's fingers, tore through the planks. "Get back," Colt ordered, his voice a low, deadly calm. He did not aim at the door this time. He moved to the side of the single window, peering through a small gap in the hide covering. The snow was a swirling white curtain, but he could make out a dark, fluid shape lunging again at the door. He waited for the next impact. When it came, and the door groaned as if it might give way, he acted. He wrenched the door open a few inches and fired in the same motion. The blast of the rifle was a deafening roar. The acrid smell of burnt powder instantly filled the cabin. The snarl outside was cut short, replaced by a high, unearthly shriek of pain and rage. He saw the big cat twist in the air and then collapse into a heap in the snow just beyond the threshold. He slammed the door shut and rammed the bar home. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind, their own ragged breathing, and the frantic pounding of their hearts. "Is it?" May whispered, her voice trembling. "It is done," Colt said. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, the rifle still clutched in his hand. The adrenaline was afire in his veins. He had protected their home. He had met the wildness of the world and turned it back. But the door was damaged. The cold wind was now whistling through the fresh gashes in the wood. "I have to fix it," he said, more to himself than to her. He pulled on his heavy coat and gloves, took a lantern and his axe, and prepared to go back out into the storm. "No, Colt, wait until morning," May pleaded, her fear for him overriding her fear of the beast. "The cold will kill us as surely as any cat," he replied grimly. He opened the door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at him, and the snow blinded him. The mountain lion lay in a dark, still heap, its lifeblood a stark red stain on the white ground. He dragged the carcass away from the door and set to work. In the flickering, wind-swept light of the lantern, he chopped planks from a spare log and, with frozen fingers, nailed them over the deep gouges in the door, reinforcing it against the storm. When he finally came back inside, covered in snow and shaking with cold, May was waiting with a tin cup of hot water and a blanket. She helped him out of his coat and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders as he knelt before the fire, holding his numb hands out to the flames. The smell of wet wool, cold pine, and the faint, metallic scent of blood clung to him. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the unabated howl of the wind. The repaired door, with its fresh, raw planks, was a testament to the battle they had just survived. The violence had breached their walls, leaving a scar. In the aftermath, in the raw, shared vulnerability, the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble as well. It was May who spoke first, her voice soft but clear in the firelight. "He kept me in the cellar," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. "After my father signed the paper, Ephraim Voss, he said it was for my own protection, to keep me from having second thoughts." Colt listened, his hands slowly regaining their feeling. He did not look at her, giving her the space to let the words out. "It was cold," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "and dark. There was a small window, high up, covered with bars. I could see the sky. I watched the clouds for days. He would bring me food. He never laid a hand on me. Not then. He just looked at me, like I was a horse he had just bought, checking my teeth, my legs. He told me the preacher was coming, and that I should be grateful. Grateful that he was willing to take me on, to clear my family's name of debt. He said I was his now, his to care for, his to own. When the storm came, one of the ranch hands, a young boy, took pity on me. He left the door unbolted. He told me to run. I do not even know his name." She finally turned to look at him, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I am not his property. Colt, I am not a debt to be paid." "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He had seen her strength, but now he saw the source of it. It was the strength of a person who had been to the bottom of a dark place and had clawed their way back into the light. Her confession hung in the air between them, a thing of terrible, fragile honesty. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not let her face the darkness alone. He owed her his own truth. "There was a girl," he began, his voice a low rumble, "in Laramie, the daughter of the saloon owner. Her name was Elizabeth." He took a breath, the memory as sharp and painful as a fresh wound. "I was young, and I thought I knew the difference between right and wrong as clearly as the difference between black and white. A man named Thompson was trying to squeeze a homesteader off his land. I spoke up. I should have kept my mouth shut, but I did not. It came to a head in the saloon. Thompson's son pulled a gun. I was faster." He stared into the fire, seeing not the flames, but the smoky, Lantern-lit chaos of the saloon. My bullet hit his belt buckle. It ricocheted. It hit Elizabeth in the arm. She screamed. I will never forget that sound. It was not a bad wound, but it was my fault. I had brought a gun to an argument, and an innocent person paid the price. The whole town turned on me. I was the troublemaker, the gunman. I left that night. I came out here to make sure that the only person my actions could ever hurt again was myself. He finally looked at May. He had stripped himself bare, shown her the mistake that had defined his life. He had taken off the armor. She did not look away. She saw the pain and the regret etched on his face. She saw the good man who had been haunted by a single, terrible moment. She reached out and placed her small, warm hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was acceptance. It was forgiveness. The space between them was no longer filled with tension or fear. It was filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. He turned his hand and gently took hers. The wind howled outside, and the fire crackled inside. And in that small, scarred cabin, two solitary souls found a common ground. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway. His lips touched hers, and it was not a kiss of passion or of desperate need. It was a kiss as quiet and as gentle as the first snowfall. It was a promise of comfort, a sealing of a silent pact. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and the faintest, hopeful hint of canned peaches. It was a recognition that even in the midst of a brutal winter, something new and fragile could begin to grow. They were startled by a sudden, frantic knocking at the door. It was not the signal. It was a desperate, urgent pounding. Colt was instantly on his feet, pushing May behind him, the Winchester once again in his hands. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice a dangerous growl. "Colt, it is me, Clay. Let me in." The voice was rough, but familiar. Clay Boone, a trapper who lived a few miles down the valley. One of the few men Colt would call a friend. He hesitated, then moved to the door and cautiously lifted the bar. Clay stumbled in, bringing a blast of snow and wind with him. He was a wiry man, with a face weathered like old leather. His eyes were wide with urgency. "You have to get her out of here." "Colt," he said, breathing hard, not even looking at May. "I just came from town. Voss has upped the reward, $100, and he has added a line to the writ." Clay paused, his gaze meeting Colt's. "It is for her, and for anyone harboring her, and it says dead or alive." The words dead or alive hung in the air, sucking all the warmth from the fire. They were not just words, they were a death sentence, a legal sanction for murder issued by a corrupt judge and a wealthy man who believed the world was his to own. The fragile peace of the cabin was shattered, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the hunt. Clay Boone stood by the door, his face grim, the wind and snow still clinging to his worn coat. He looked from Colt's stony expression to May's pale, frightened face. "They know you bought extra supplies." "Colt," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Those two men Voss hired. They followed you part of the way out of town. They are camped on the old logging road, just waiting. They figure you are either with her or you are supplying her." Colt's mind worked quickly, the years of solitude having honed his thoughts to a sharp, practical edge. Running was no longer an option. There was nowhere to run in this vast, white wilderness that Voss's money could not reach. Hiding was a temporary solution at best. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a trap. There was only one path left. He had to walk back into the world he had abandoned and face the beast in its den. "We will split them up," Colt said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling storm of their fear. "Clay, I need you to take May. Not back to your place. There is an old trapper's line cabin up on Whisper Creek. It is remote, and no one has used it in years. Can you get her there?" Clay nodded, his eyes narrowed in thought. "It will be a hard ride," But we can make it. We will have to go over the ridge to avoid the logging road. Good, Colt said. He turned to May. Her eyes were wide, but she was not crying. The fire of survival he had seen in her was burning brightly. I am going to ride back to Redemption. I am going to make it easy for them to follow me. I will lead them away from you. No, she whispered, her voice fierce. You cannot face them alone. Colt, they will kill you. They will kill us both if we stay here, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. This is the only way. You need to be safe. I need to know you are safe. He looked at Clay. Get her to the cabin, then go to town. Find Sadie Quinn at the saloon. Tell her what is happening. Tell her. Tell her I need the truth to have a voice. He did not know exactly what he was asking for, but he trusted Sadie's shrewdness, her network of whispers and secrets. The plan was a desperate gamble, a simple design born of necessity. Clay would lead May to safety under the cover of the storm, their tracks hopefully erased by the new falling snow. Colt, in the meantime, would ride in the opposite direction, toward town, leaving a clear and obvious trail for Voss's men to follow. He would be the bait, drawing the wolves onto his own scent, giving May the time she needed to disappear. The farewell was brief and stolen, a moment of profound quiet in the heart of the storm. He helped May put on a spare set of his own warm clothes, which were far too big for her but would offer better protection than her thin dress. As she stood by the door, bundled and small, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. I have spent my whole life running from men like him, she said, her voice a low, intense whisper. Do not let him be the end of you. He will not be, Colt said, his voice a promise. He squeezed her hand, a lifetime of unspoken words passing between them in that single, fleeting touch. Then he let her go. Clay led her out into the swirling snow, and they were swallowed by the white darkness in an instant. Colt watched them go, then barred the door. He waited, counting the slow seconds, giving them a head start. Then he gathered his gun belt, his Winchester, and a small pouch of ammunition. He stepped out of the cabin, leaving the door unbarred behind him. He mounted his buckskin and, without a backward glance at the small home that had been his refuge for 5 years, he rode straight and true toward Redemption. He arrived as the weak afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the muddy, snow-clogged street. He did not try to be discreet. He rode down the center of the town, his horse's hooves churning the slush, the Winchester held loosely in his right hand. Heads turned. Conversations on the boardwalks faltered and died. The men who had been lounging in front of the general store straightened up, their eyes following him. He was a specter from the mountains, a man who had kept to himself for years, now riding into the heart of their world like a harbinger of a coming storm. He could feel the weight of their stares, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a grim, knowing anticipation. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the very place where his life had gone wrong in Laramie. He looped the reins around the hitching post and pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with a smell of cheap whiskey, stale cigar smoke, and wet wool. The room fell silent the moment he entered. Every eye turned to him. At a table, in the back, Ephraim Voss sat with Judge Dake. Voss was a big man, with a florid face and small, predatory eyes that missed nothing. He was dressed in an expensive broadcloth suit that seemed out of place in the rough-hewn saloon. Judge Dake was a small, weaselly man, with a face that looked like it had been soured by a lifetime of his own bad judgments. Standing near their table, trying to look casual, were the 2 men Colt had seen in town, the hired guns. Colt ignored them all. He walked to the bar, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards. Sadie was there, her face pale, her eyes wide. Clay Boone stood at the far end of the bar, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He gave Colt a barely perceptible nod. Colt laid a coin on the bar. "Whiskey," he said, his voice carrying in the unnatural silence. "You have got a lot of nerve." "McRae," Ephraim Voss's voice boomed from the back of the room. "Coming in here. You are wanted for kidnapping and theft." Colt took the glass Sadie poured for him and turned slowly, leaning his back against the bar. He looked directly at Judge Dake. "Is that what your writ says? Judge kidnapping, theft of what a horse and buckboard or a human being." Judge Dake sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "The law is clear. The woman is bound by contract. She is chattel, property of Mr. Voss until her father's debt is cleared." "And you signed it," Colt said, his voice dangerously soft. "You took the law and you twisted it into a leash for your master. But you forgot one thing. People are not property, and debts of money are not paid with a person's life." From the crowd of onlookers, a low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. It was a small sound, but it was there. "This is a legal matter," Dake said, puffing out his chest, trying to regain his authority. "Then let us talk about the law," Colt said. He reached into his coat pocket. The two hired guns tensed, their hands moving toward their pistols. Colt moved slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled piece of paper. He tossed it onto the center of a nearby poker table. "That is a statement from a girl who worked in Voss's kitchen, a girl who saw May locked in the cellar, a girl who heard Voss boasting that he had bought himself a wife for the price of a bad debt. Sadie was kind enough to get it for me." Sadie stood behind the bar, her arms crossed, her expression fierce. A few of the townsmen moved closer to the table, their curiosity overcoming their fear. One of them, a blacksmith with hands the size of hams, picked up the paper and began to read it aloud, his voice slow but steady. Voss surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "That is a lie slander from a disgruntled servant." "Is it?" Colt asked, his gaze unwavering. "Or is it the truth you tried to bury? The truth that you did not want a wife. You wanted a possession. The saloon was a tinderbox, ready to explode." The men of the town were looking from the letter to Voss, then to Judge Dake. They were simple men, most of them, but they understood the difference between a law that served justice and a law that served a rich man's appetite. Voss saw the tide turning. He saw the doubt in the eyes of the crowd. He looked at his two hired guns, a silent command passing between them. "The law is behind me," Voss snarled, his hand creeping toward the pistol tucked into his waistcoat. Colt gave him a cold, grim smile. "Then tell the law to dodge this." It happened in a heartbeat. The hired gun on the right, the younger of the two, went for his pistol. He was fast, but Colt was faster. The years of solitude had not dulled his reflexes. They had honed them to a razor's edge. His Colt revolver seemed to leap into his hand. The first shot was a deafening explosion that sent a tremor through the room. The hired gun was thrown backward, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before he crashed into a table. The second hired gun had his pistol clear, and he fired. The bullet tearing through the fleshy part of Colt's left shoulder, spinning him partway around. A hot, searing pain shot through him, but he stayed on his feet. He brought his own gun to bear and fired again. The second man staggered back, clutching his chest, and slid to the floor. In the ringing silence that followed, there were only two men left standing in the center of the confrontation. Colt, his left arm hanging useless and blood-staining his shirt, and Ephraim Voss, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, his own pistol now clear of his waistcoat. Voss raised his gun, but he hesitated. He was a man who paid others to do his fighting. In that moment of hesitation, the men of redemption made their choice. The blacksmith threw a heavy wooden chair that crashed into Voss's arm, sending his shot wild into the ceiling. Clay Boone leveled his shotgun from the corner. Deputy Harlan. His face ashen, but his eyes resolved, finally drew his own pistol and aimed it squarely at Voss. "Drop it!" "Voss," Harlan said, his voice shaking but clear. "It is over." Voss looked around the room, at the sea of hard, unforgiving faces. He saw no allies. He saw only the community he had tried to dominate, now united against him. His power, built on money and fear, had evaporated in the space of 2 gunshots. But Judge Dake saw his chance. While all eyes were on Voss, he scurried from the table and bolted for the back door. A rat deserting a sinking ship. No one tried to stop him. His authority was gone. His power broken. He was nothing. Voss, his face contorted in a final snarl of defiance, made a fatal mistake. He turned his pistol toward Colt. He never had the chance to fire. Colt's 3rd shot was precise, measured, and final. Ephraim Voss collapsed to the floor. The legal writ that had been his weapon now just a piece of paper lying in a pool of whiskey and blood. The silence that fell was absolute. It was broken only by the sound of Colt's revolver hitting the floor as his wounded shoulder finally gave out. He staggered, the room spinning around him, and leaned heavily against the bar, the faces of the townsmen swimming before his eyes. He had faced the beast. He had paid a price in blood, but in the smoky, violent heart of the Redemption Saloon, he had won. Justice, it turned out, sometimes had to speak with the voice of a gun. The world came back to him in fragments. A patch of sunlight on a rough wooden ceiling that was not his own. The sharp, clean scent of lye soap and something medicinal. The low murmur of voices, one a familiar, gravelly rumble. The other, a woman's, sharp and clear. He was adrift in a sea of fever, his wounded shoulder a hot, throbbing anchor pulling him down into the dark. He would surface for a moment, his eyes struggling to focus, and then the waves of pain and confusion would wash over him again. He was not in his cabin. This room was brighter, the air warmer. He was in a proper bed with clean sheets, a luxury so foreign it felt like a dream. He remembered the saloon, the shattering roar of the guns, the searing heat in his shoulder. He remembered falling. The rest was a blur. During his lucid moments, he began to piece together his surroundings. He was in a room at Sadie Quinn's boarding house. Clay Boone's stoic face would occasionally swim into his vision, a silent sentinel by his bedside. Sadie would come in, her movements brisk and efficient, changing his bandage with a practiced hand that belied her sharp tongue. And then there was the other presence, a quieter one. It was May. She was always there, a still figure in a chair by the window, or moving softly around the room. In the depths of his fever, he would wake to find a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, her touch as gentle as a whisper. He would see her silhouette in the lamplight, her head bent over a bowl, stirring something. She was the constant in his shifting, painful world. He learned later that she had not gone to the trapper's cabin. When Clay had found her, she had refused to go any farther than his small homestead on the edge of town, insisting she wait for news. When the news came, a chaotic story of a shootout and a wounded hero, she had not hesitated. She had walked straight into Redemption, a town full of staring eyes and whispering tongues, and gone to Colt's side. The woman who had been terrified of her own shadow was now facing down the judgment of an entire community for the man who had saved her. Her fear had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing force, but a fire that fueled a fierce, protective resolve. She became his nurse, his advocate, his anchor. She learned from Sadie how to clean and dress the wound, her hands shaking the first time, but steady and sure thereafter. She overcame her fear of the blood, her revulsion at the torn flesh, because her fear for him was greater. His fever was the true enemy. It rose and fell, leaving him weak and rambling. It was during these times that May's quiet strength shone brightest. She learned from Sadie that the bark of the willow tree could fight a fever. She spent hours by the creek, peeling the bark from the slender branches, her hands raw from the cold and the rough work. She brewed it into a dark, bitter tea, patiently coaxing the hot liquid past his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. He drifted in and out of a dreamscape filled with snow and gunpowder. In one lucid moment, he opened his eyes and saw her holding the tin cup, her face etched with worry in the soft lamplight. The tea was impossibly bitter, but he swallowed it. "If this tea is medicine," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper, a ghost of his old humor flickering in his fevered mind, "I am willing to be sick longer." A small, weary smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Do not," she said softly, her voice a gentle command. "The hay needs hauling next season." The words were simple, but they were a promise of a future, of seasons changing, of work to be done together. It was the most potent medicine she could have given him. While Colt fought his private battle, the town of Redemption was fighting one of its own. The shootout at the saloon had been a catharsis, a violent lancing of a boil that had been festering for years. Ephraim Voss was dead. His 2 hired guns were buried in the town cemetery, and Judge Dake had simply vanished, his office empty, his reign of purchased justice over in the power vacuum. A new sense of community began to stir. Deputy Harlan, no longer a timid follower, but a man who had found his courage when it mattered most, organized a town meeting. They would elect a new marshal, a man of their own choosing, and rewrite the laws to serve the people, not the powerful. The town was healing, finding its own moral compass in the aftermath of the violence Colt had brought to its doorstep. The fever broke on a bright, clear morning. Colt woke to find the world in sharp focus. The pain in his shoulder was a dull, manageable ache. The sunlight streaming through the window was warm and real. May was asleep in the chair, her head resting on her arms, her face soft and peaceful in the morning light. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her features, and felt a profound sense of gratitude that went deeper than words. She had rescued him, just as surely as he had rescued her from the snow. The days that followed were a time of slow, steady healing. Spring arrived in the high country, a gradual, miraculous transformation. The snow receded, revealing the pale, sleeping grass beneath. The creeks swelled with meltwater, their sound a constant, cheerful murmur. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. One afternoon, a man in a dusty suit arrived at the boarding house. He was a circuit lawyer from Cheyenne, a man whose business was the untangling of legal knots. Sadie had sent for him. He met with May in the small parlor, while Colt sat on the porch, his arm in a sling, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. The lawyer emerged an hour later, a satisfied look on his face. He handed May a thick, formal-looking document. "The contract your father signed is not worth the paper it is written on," the lawyer announced, his voice carrying out to the porch. It was a document of coercion and indenture, not a legal marriage agreement, with Mr. Voss deceased and no legal heirs stepping forward. His estate is in the hands of the territory. You, Miss Harper, are a free woman. You owe nothing. You are bound to no one. May stood there, holding the paper in her hands. It was an official affidavit, a declaration of her freedom, stamped with an official seal of dark blue ink. The ink was pressed into the paper in a circle, a small, perfect sun that represented the dawn of a new life. Freedom, she discovered, was a heavy and terrifying thing. For her entire life, her path had been dictated by others, her father's wishes, her husband's demands, Voss's cruel ownership. Now, the path ahead was a vast, unmarked wilderness. For the first time, she had to choose her own direction. The choice was made more real a week later by the arrival of a letter. Sadie had helped her write to a distant aunt in Ohio, and the reply had come on the eastbound stage. The letter was kind, full of sympathy and offers of a home. It spoke of a quiet, respectable life, of church socials and neatly tended gardens, a world away from the violence and hardship of the West. It was a lifeline, an escape route back to a world she understood. She held the letter from her aunt in one hand and the lawyer's declaration in the other. She would sit on the porch for hours, watching the green spread across the distant hills, the two pieces of paper representing the two possible futures before her. The East was safety, a return to what was known. The West was cold. It was the memory of a fire in a blizzard, the shared fear and the quiet comfort, the taste of a first gentle kiss. It was a life she had not chosen, but one she had fought for, side by side with the man now slowly recovering his strength in the chair beside her. As Colt healed, he grew quieter, a familiar melancholy settling over him. He watched her as she read her letter from the East, and he built a wall around his heart. He had done what he had to do. He had stood for her, fought for her. Now, she was free. And he knew, with a painful certainty, that the best thing for her was to take the lifeline she had been offered. He could not ask her to chain her newfound freedom to a man like him, a man with a haunted past and an uncertain future, a man whose only home was a lonely cabin in the mountains. One morning, he woke to find her gone. The chair by the window was empty. The small bundle of her belongings, which had rested at the foot of her cot, was missing. A cold, sharp dread pierced through him, more painful than any bullet wound. She had made her choice. She had left for the East, for the safe, respectable life she deserved. She had left without saying goodbye. He told himself it was for the best, that it was what he had wanted for her. But the feeling in his gut was one of devastating loss. He got dressed, his movements clumsy with his one good arm. He found Clay in the saloon's kitchen. "She is gone," Colt said, his voice flat. Clay looked at him, his expression unreadable. "The eastbound stage does not leave until tomorrow." "I am riding back to my cabin," Colt said. It was the only thing he could think to do, the only place he had to go. The ride was long and quiet. The world was bursting with the life of spring, but he saw none of it. He rode with his head down, his thoughts a gray, empty landscape. As he neared the clearing, he guided his horse through the familiar pines, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. And then he smelled it. Faint on the breeze, but unmistakable. The scent of wood smoke. He urged his horse forward, his heart beginning to pound with a fragile Bugan Xiang Xinde Shi Wang. He broke through the tree line into the clearing, and he saw it. A thin, steady plume of smoke was rising from the stone chimney of his cabin. The door, scarred and patched but standing strong, was slightly ajar. He dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. He pushed the door open. May was there. She was sweeping the floor with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. A fire was crackling cheerfully in the hearth. A pot of water was set to boil. She had not run away. She had come home. She looked up as he entered, a small, shy smile on her face. She saw the question in his eyes, the raw, vulnerable hope. "I was just checking the chimney," she said softly, to make sure it was still drawing right after the winter. He stood there in the doorway, the warm spring sunlight at his back, and looked at the woman and the fire. He had thought freedom was about her leaving, about her escaping the West, but he had been wrong. True freedom was not about running away. It was about choosing where you belonged, and May had made her choice. He did not speak for a long time. He just stood there, a silhouette framed by the bright spring morning, taking in the impossible, miraculous sight of her. She was not a ghost or a dream. She was real, solid, and she had chosen to be here. She had taken the raw, brutal materials of her survival and was beginning to build a life from them, starting with the simple, elemental act of sweeping a floor and lighting a fire. His fire, their fire. A slow smile. The first genuine, unguarded smile he had allowed himself in years, spread across his face. It was a smile of such profound relief that it felt like a thaw inside his own chest, a breaking up of a long and bitter winter. The weeks that followed were a season of reconstruction, both for the cabin and for the two people who now called it home. Their first project was the door. The raw planks he had nailed up in the storm were functional, but ugly. A constant reminder of the violence that had scarred their beginning. Together, they took them down. With his one good arm, he showed her how to measure and saw, and with her patience and his strength, they crafted a new door from seasoned pine. It was thick and solid, with a heavy, smooth sliding bar on the inside. It was not just a repair, it was a statement. This was their threshold, a boundary they had built together to keep the world at bay. As his shoulder healed, their world expanded beyond the four walls of the cabin. They repaired and strengthened the lean-to for the cattle, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. He would lift the heavy logs, and she would be there with the hammer and pegs. He learned the sound of her humming as she worked, a soft, tuneless melody that became the background music to his days. She learned the quiet language of his moods, knowing when to speak and when to let the comfortable silence stretch between them. They turned over a patch of earth near the cabin, clearing it of rocks and roots, their hands deep in the rich, dark soil. Sadie Quinn, on a visit to bring them news from town, brought a small sack of seeds. They planted a garden of beans, squash, and corn. They watered it from the creek, and they watched with a shared sense of wonder as the first green shoots pushed their way up into the sunlight. It was a small patch of cultivated hope in the vast wilderness. Life was not a storybook. They were two fiercely independent people who had been forged in solitude and hardship, and learning to share a small space was a clumsy, sometimes difficult dance. They argued over small things. He liked his coffee boiled until it was thick as mud. She preferred it weaker. She had a habit of leaving her mending in a pile by the fire. He was a man who believed everything had its proper place. These small frictions were not signs of a fracture, but the necessary grinding and polishing of two stones learning to fit together. The arguments would flare up, brief and hot, and then die down, usually ending with a shared, reluctant smile and a quiet apology. Colt, the man who had sought isolation as a shield, found himself becoming a neighbor. Clay Boone would stop by on his way to check his traps, and the two men would share a pipe on the porch, their conversation a comfortable mix of long silences and brief comments on the weather or the price of furs. Colt was no longer just the hermit on the mountain. He was part of the small, scattered community of the high country. May, in turn, became something of a legend in redemption. Her story, whispered from person to person, had transformed from a piece of scandalous gossip into a tale of courage. She was the woman who had faced down Ephraim Voss and won, a symbol of resilience for the other women in town. When she rode into redemption with Colt for supplies, people would nod to her with a new respect. Sadie Quinn would draw her into the saloon for a cup of tea, and soon other women would join them, their conversations a quiet but powerful current of shared strength and newfound solidarity. One afternoon in late summer, as they were stacking the last of the cut hay, May went into the cabin and came back out with the letter from her aunt in Ohio. She had read it many times, its crisp pages softened and worn at the creases. She stood there in the golden afternoon light, the scent of hay and pine in the air, and read it one last time. It was a letter from another world, a world of fences and paved streets, a life of predictable, gentle rhythms. Colt stopped his work, watching her. He did not speak, his heart a tight knot in his chest. This was her choice, and he would not stand in her way. She finished reading, then slowly, deliberately, folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope. She walked over to him, her expression calm and certain. She reached up and placed the letter on a high, dusty shelf just inside the lean-to, a place for things to be stored and remembered, but not used. My aunt will have to find someone else to help with her garden, she said, her voice soft but firm. Mine is just starting to grow. He looked at her, at the quiet determination in her sky-blue eyes, and he knew the last ghost had been laid to rest. Her freedom was not in leaving, but in choosing to stay. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb gently stroking her skin. It was a touch full of a reverence and a love that needed no words. Autumn came, painting the aspens on the high ridges in strokes of brilliant gold and fiery orange. The days grew shorter, the nights sharper. They harvested their small garden, the bounty of their shared labor. They chopped and stacked wood, their pile growing into a fortress against the coming cold. The cabin was ready. They were ready. The first snow of the new winter came not in a furious blizzard, but as a gentle, quiet blessing. It began in the night, soft, fat flakes drifting down from a dark, silent sky. When they woke, the world was transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of white covered the clearing, softening the sharp edges of the landscape, muffling all sound. The only colors were the dark green of the pines and the thin, gray curl of smoke rising from their own chimney. They stood together on the porch, a shared mug of hot coffee steaming between their hands, and watched the silent fall. The air was crisp and clean, so cold it felt pure. May shivered, a small, involuntary tremor that ran through her. Colt looked down at her, a question in his eyes. She looked up at him and smiled, a radiant, joyful expression that lit up her whole face. "It is not the cold," she said, her voice full of a quiet wonder. "It is just everything. I am alive to feel it." That evening, they sat by the fire, the heart of their home beating a steady, warm rhythm against the cold. The new door was barred, the shelves were stocked, and the world outside was quiet under its blanket of snow. This winter was not an enemy to be survived, but a season to be lived. May gave another small shiver. Colt set his empty mug on the hearth, opened his arms, and drew her into his lap, settling her against his chest. It was the same gesture he had made on that terrible night of the storm, but everything was different now. Then, he had held a terrified stranger. Now, he held his life. He wrapped his arms around her, a circle of warmth and safety. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. They sat in comfortable silence, two solitary souls who had found their home in each other, and watched the snow fall softly outside the window. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect. And please consider subscribing to our channel Wild West Night, liking the video, and supporting us further by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.